and how its failure led to the Constitution. So these are the questions that we're going to be looking at. You can also find them up on PLUS portals. So in 1781, with the Battle of Yorktown, the American Revolution was coming to an end. And in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the revolution and gave the United States its independence to form whatever government it wanted. So the U.S. was given very generous terms of the treaty, but they did have two conditions. They had to pay debts that were owed to English banks and lenders, and they had to return any seized property from loyalists back to the rightful owners. So, kind of a little aside here, there's a question about whether the American Revolution was really a revolution, whether life really changed in the United States or not. On the one hand, this revolution was based on political ideas that were radical at the time, such as equality, liberty, rule of law, and the rest. It also represents a departure from the monarchy and kind of aristocracy-based system into a system based on republicanism and democracy, in which the ultimate power would rest with the people. But on the other hand, day-to-day life does not really change very much as a result of the revolution. It's not a social upheaval. The upper class remains the upper class, the lower class remains the lower class, and ultimately this doesn't really change that much for women, slaves, and others who were denied rights to begin with. And so, post-revolution, 13 colonies become the United States, and they have the right to govern themselves. Now, during the war, the Second Continental Congress had actually formed the first United States government under a document called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union between the states. Now, this first government had to deal with the problem of combining 13 colonies, who then became 13 states, that ultimately distrust each other, they're very diverse, they're very fiercely independent, and so creating a government to bring them all together is going to prove to be difficult. And so the government under the Articles of Confederation, it's not really much of a national government. It's more of a league of friendship in which each of the states were sovereign. They were very independent, and ultimately they act like they are their own country. And so ultimately, a lot of these states only looked at the Union as a way to coordinate their common foreign policy against a common enemy. And the only real purpose of the Union was to organize the colonies for the war. And so once the war ends, the states are again going to fall back into the disunion they had before the war, and the government under the Articles of Confederation is going to struggle to address the growing problems in American society. So here's what the government is like under the Articles. Because each of the states was fiercely independent, and largely they had never had a federal government before, they created this government that would be incredibly weak, favoring states' rights, leaving the states having most of the power and having very strong governments at that level, while removing a lot of powers from the federal government. The government under the Articles of Confederation was not able to tax, which meant that they could not pay for anything. They were unable to force states to actually follow any sort of law. They could not force the states to abide by the Treaty of Paris or any other trade deals, and they were also not allowed to control a common currency for all 13 of the states. And so during the war, this Continental Congress and this government of the Articles of Confederation had run into some major problems. During the war, this government was unable to force states to pay taxes or provide soldiers for the Continental Army. As a result of this, the Continental Army often suffered in terms of supplies, in terms of troop numbers, because of the government's inability to force the states to contribute equally to the war effort. George Washington wrote often to the Continental Congress asking for supplies during Valley Forge, but that weak central government was really unable to respond to the needs of the army during the Revolution. And these problems of the government only intensified once the revolution was over. Firstly, this government, each state only had one vote. And so a huge state like Virginia got the same one vote as very small states like Rhode Island, leading the larger states to believe that this federal government didn't represent their interests fairly. Also, under the Articles, every state was allowed to print its own money, make its own trade deals, could refuse to follow the peace treaty with Great Britain that ended the war. They could also create laws that would tax or regulate goods from other states. So the equivalent of this would be like in Illinois if we had to pay an extra tax to eat cheese that was made in Wisconsin. And so all of these things the states could do create a mess of problems. And ultimately, the common problem is that the states are going to fail to pay the wartime debts to soldiers and to the suppliers of the war, as well as fail to pay the debts to England that they had agreed to under the Treaty of Paris. And so ultimately, the Articles post-revolution are going to prove to be an ineffectual government, which creates a situation in which people believe that there's a need for a new government. One of the big things after the war that's going to be an issue are the Western territories that were won from Great Britain. The question was, who owns those territories? Should they go to a state? Should they go to multiple states? Should they be their own states? And ultimately, politically, if two states disagree about something, there is no way to resolve those disputes. Virginia can do something to North Carolina, and ultimately there is nobody to stand in the middle and resolve those disputes. In terms of economics, because of the failure of the states to pay back all the debts from the war, the credit rating of the United States was incredibly low. Foreign governments, foreign banks, and even domestic banks did not want to lend money to these governments. Also, 7 states printed their own money. It was called paper money because it actually wasn't backed by gold or any other valuable resource. And so as these 7 states printed their own money, the value of that money decreased and decreased, something that we call inflation. And also in terms of economics, trades between the states become very, very difficult. So if I was a business owner in Virginia and I wanted to sell things in Massachusetts, it would be incredibly difficult because every state had their own laws, taxes, and they could tax goods from other states. Also, trade with Europe is going to be a problem. Every state was allowed to actually negotiate with European states and businesses on their own, which meant that the states got exploited. One state could go to Europe and charge very, very low taxes to sell their items, and other states may charge very high rates. And so what the European merchants would do is they would take the money they would take their goods, ship them into the state with the lowest amount of taxes, and then they would take them into other states. And so essentially the United States was losing out on a lot of revenue from tariffs. And then ultimately, foreign policy-wise, no European government, not even France that had backed the United States in the war, is going to trust the United States because the government that's negotiating the treaties is unable to actually make sure those treaties are carried out. And so by fall of 1786, there had been a series of problems that really highlighted for certain Americans, the need to create a new government. The majority of Americans are okay with the Articles of Confederation. They feel they fought the war for states' rights, and so they don't really see a need to change. But 4 major events in fall of 1786 are going to change some people's minds. The first dispute is over the rights to the Mississippi River. Again, Western territories, not necessarily sure who controls those. And so the northeastern states battled with the South over a treaty to give rights to navigate the Mississippi River to Spain. But what this really highlighted was the idea that there was no way to resolve problems between the states. In Massachusetts, a group of farmers led by Daniel Shays attempted to overthrow the government in Massachusetts after their farms were foreclosed upon after the government's refusal to print more money. And so Shays' Rebellion happened, and during this rebellion, the United States government, under the Articles of Confederation, does nothing to act. It's up to Massachusetts to defend themselves from rebellion, and the failure of the U.S. government to act when national security was threatened highlighted for a lot of people just how weak this government was. Thirdly, a convention was called in Annapolis, Maryland, to try to change the Articles of Confederation, make changes in order to make them a more powerful government. Well, out of the 13 states, only 5 states sent delegates, which showed that ultimately the states themselves didn't really take this government under the Articles very seriously. And the fourth thing that happens is that George Washington is ultimately convinced that in order to save the American Republic, he would need to get involved in encouraging Americans to come up with a new form of government. Also in the story with George Washington are Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. These are two people who are going to be well respected in the colonies for their political ideas. Alexander Hamilton had been George Washington's right-hand man during the Revolution, and James Madison was one of Virginia's major political leaders. These two figures are going to be instrumental in pushing forward the idea that the Articles of Confederation simply were not working and that a new government was needed. So, in 1787, a second convention after Annapolis is called. It's called the Philadelphia Convention. They placed George Washington in charge of this convention, and his prestige, along with James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they convinced the other 13 states, all the 13 states, to show up to discuss the Articles. And ultimately, when we talk about the Constitutional Convention, they meet in Philadelphia, they black out all the windows, and they conduct these meetings in secret. The main players in this are James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, George Washington, and they essentially decide to start the Second American Revolution. What they end up pushing for at this convention is not a change to the Articles, but a push for the creation of an entirely new government that would overthrow the Articles of Confederation. So essentially, the Constitution can be called the Second American Revolution. And James Madison is really going to be the architect of this new government. He shows up in Philadelphia with a plan to create a new form of government. He sees the problem as the states being far too independent, and the U.S. needs to be able to solve big issues together. And the solution that Madison comes up with is to create a republic based around the idea of federalism. And federalism means that power is going to be shared between state governments in a new, more powerful federal government. And the idea of this shared sovereignty is that local issues would remain under local control, whereas national issues such as trade with foreign powers, treaties, and interstate commerce, trade between the states, would come under national control. And at the Constitutional Convention, they face a couple of major issues that they're going to need to resolve in order to make a new government. These issues are representation. How many votes should each state get? What powers is the new federal government going to have? And of course, the issue of slavery that has surfaced during the Declaration of Independence debate and will surface again about. And so ultimately, two plans for a new government are going to be proposed. James Madison proposes the Virginia Plan, in which they say that the powers of the federal government will be split into a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. That the Congress itself, the legislature, will have two houses, one of representatives and also a Senate chosen by the states. They decide in the Virginia Plan that representation should be by population, that bigger states should get more votes. And they decided also to propose the federal government could tax, regulate trade, and force the states to follow laws. However, the Virginia Plan was controversial, and a second plan created by William Patterson, known as the New Jersey Plan, really stuck pretty close to the original Articles. They advocated for one house of Congress, equal representation among the states, but they did also want to give the federal government the power to tax as well as regulate trade. So see if you can figure out which states supported the Virginia Plan and which states supported the New Jersey Plan. So ultimately, the two sides are going to be not that far apart. And so Ben Franklin, a well-respected figure in America, is called upon to create a committee in order to come up with a compromise between the plans that everybody could agree on. And what this committee ends up coming up with is our Constitution that we know today, called the Great Compromise. They decide to split the two houses of Congress between the New Jersey and the Virginia Plan, having a House of Representatives elected by the people that is going to be represented by population, and then a Senate elected by state legislatures in which each state would get an equal number of votes. They ultimately decide to give the federal government the full powers of taxing, regulating trade, and making laws that the states had to follow. However, while this is taking place, slavery is still an issue. And the question is put forward, should slavery be protected by this new constitution? And secondly, should slaves count as people for a state's population? And this is an issue that almost derails the Constitutional Convention decide on a compromise. They decide that in the Three-Fifths Compromise that for every 5 slaves, 3 are going to count as population for the states. And secondly, it's decided that the government is not allowed to ban the slave trade until 1808, and the government is restricted in taxing the slave trade. So we have a United States that is going to claim to represent equality rights. However, it ultimately protects the idea of slavery in the United States. And so the Constitution itself gets created, and this type of government is called a republic, in which people don't directly vote for every issue, but instead they elect representatives to represent them. And so the Constitution creates a republic based on the ideas of popular sovereignty, federalism, the separation of powers, and ultimately limited governments. And so the government that's created under the Constitution is still the government that we live under today. And ultimately, when we talk about the Constitution, it's going to serve as a framework for our arguments about what government should and should not do. We first argue about what the Constitution means. Beyond simply the powers of government, the creation of the Congress and the President, what exactly did the Founding Fathers mean when they talked about these issues or the powers of government? Also, we talk about debates over where are the lines drawn between the state and the federal powers. We debate liberty and order. What are the limits to our freedoms? And what are the limits to government powers under this Constitution? And over time, the power of the federal government has changed significantly from when it was created in 1787. And ultimately, what we're going to talk about in this American story is that the Constitution is flexible, that every generation has changed it slightly, and the power of the federal government, what it does and what it doesn't do, as well as the meaning of the Constitution itself, is going to change over time in this story. And so ultimately, when we talk about the Constitution, it was a reaction to problems that occurred under the first government, and it's a framework that we still live under today. And so, after the Constitution was written, it was far from approved. It still had to be ratified, voted on by all the states, and once this document was published, it proved to be very controversial. And so we're going to stop our story here in order to look at the Constitution itself, but we're going to come back to the debate over ratification of the Constitution.